Hey everyone, I'm Adam White. I'm a solution architect in the Salesforce Professional Services practice here at Salesforce. I am based out of Richmond, Virginia, and I am a big Flownatic. I'm a contributor on the UnofficialSF community, and among a lot of things, I also publish a monthly blog, or rather vlog, if you will, on YouTube that highlights all the cool stuff that people in the community are doing around Flow. And I also happen to be 9X certified. So what I'm going to talk through today are some best practices around Flow through two of the articles that I've written recently on the Architect blog and the Admin blog. Just a quick primer on when to use invoked actions. I'll have a quick summary of the different actions components I cover throughout the presentation. Some best practices and lessons learned through these actions and components on UnofficialSF and other places. And then I'll show the demo of the Dataloader on guardrails. So two recent articles that have been posted recently that I've contributed to are the 7 things architects should know about Flow and the ultimate guide to Flow best practices and standards. One of them's on the Salesforce Architects blog over at Medium. The other one is our admin blog. So make sure you check those out. The links should be sent through our Trailblazer community. All right, so when should you actually start thinking about using invoked actions and components? Well, Flow is extremely powerful, as we all know, but it does have its limits and things that it's not necessarily intended to be used for. So the first thing I would recommend is actually going through the Architect's Guide to Automation. And even though it does have architects in the title, it's, there's something for everyone in it. It has some things like roadmap, and when you should expect parity between process builder and Flow. It's got a lot of coverage around limitations in Flow, when you should start thinking about using invocable Apex. But just to kind of summarize, these are kind of the 4 biggies that I see. And the first one is large data volumes. So Flow can only hit 2,000 steps or elements in a single Flow interview. So if you're going to be in a situation where you're looping over a ton of records, it really just depends. There's no hard number, but once you start getting around the 400 and 500 number of records and you're looping over all 400 or 500 of them, then you should really need to start thinking about optimizing your Flow or using invoked Apex, because let's say you're looping over 500 records and you've got 3 elements inside your loop. Well, you've got your loop element, and you've got those 3 elements. So multiply basically 4, however many times records you have. So let's say 500 records times 4, you've already hit the element limit. So you're probably going to hit some failures, basically. So that's a biggie. And to kind of go along with that is limits on collection processing. So Flow is not the most efficient when working with big collections. Apex has a lot more at its disposal to work with larger collections at the moment. So if you find yourself hitting those limits, definitely start thinking about using an invocable to get what you need out of a collection. For example, filtering and finding a record within a collection. Screen interactions and outputs are not always admin friendly, right? So like the best example I can think of are like multi-selects, for example. Like the data table component made by Eric Smith deals with this through outputting a clean collection of records instead of a comma separated list of IDs. So that's one scenario. And then asynchronous processing. So Flow doesn't have a way out of the box to create batch jobs or use the bulk API for doing mass data loads. So if you find yourself needing to update 200,000 records, for example, you're pretty much out of luck with out of the box Flow. Now that's not to say you can't use things like invocable actions, which we'll see later. So just some considerations through the demo today. The process may not work well for extremely large data volumes. This guardrail experience is not meant for extremely large data loads, right? So those should still be going through your architect team if you have one, maybe your developers that are a little more in tune with your org and limits that you might hit when uploading hundreds of thousands of records. So this is not meant for that. And most of the biggest reason, obviously, are the reasons before with like the element limit and things like that, but also with something called a heap limit. So the CSV is basically going through memory, and to put it simply, there's only a certain amount of memory that Salesforce will allow and give to you when parsing that CSV. So there's no hard limit per se, but you do want to do your tests and due diligence around some sample files before you would roll this out to production. So number 2 is going to be slightly less relevant because of some recent improvements made to the CSV action, but you do want to make sure you're testing some sample files in your development boxes before you roll this thing out with things like long text fields and rich text area fields if you've got some funky formatting in your field values. So execute SOQL is one of my favorite actions, and I'm going to be highlighting that in this presentation, but it's not to be used in auto launch flows or triggered flows, predominantly because it's not well bulkified. So if you running in a situation where where the execute SOQL action runs in a scenario where 100 records are triggering 100 flows with this action, you are probably going to hit SOQL limits for that. So it's fantastic for screen flows where you know what the scope is, but it's not as good in auto launch flows. And number 4 is actually another one that might not be relevant soon with the improvements made. So there was a member of the community that just submitted some improvements to it. So there's a piece of the flow that I'll show you where I trim leading and trailing spaces for the unique identifier in the CSV. So this is probably a little less relevant for the future version of the CSV action, but just keep that in mind. And then another thing I'll demo in this guardrail experience is a backup file before you actually do the data load. So that still generates a file. So you're going to want to consider some sort of cleanup job or process to remove uploaded files. This list will be posted with Rakesh and Michelle, but essentially these are the different actions that I'm going to be highlighting today, and I'm going to post this with the presentation. But as we go through them, I'll talk about each one of them. And lastly, do your due diligence. And this is going to be hard for some of the less technical folks on the call, but I did want to just call these things out. So these are community member contributed actions and components. So don't assume everything is 100% quality and 100% tested for your org. So if you have developers, do a code review with the code, or if you're a consultant, do it with your client and your customer to make sure they understand. It wasn't written by us, or us being you. So if you have the capacity to do that, I would recommend that. And the other one is for some of these actions come through unlocked and unmanaged packages, which is very different from a managed package, which means your actions and components that you try to install when you try and go through production. And each of these have their own test class, right? So when you try and deploy it, you have to also include the test class with it. And with test classes, what it does is it essentially creates records in your system. And there's a base set of criteria for those records that it's creating. So if you have like validation rules, for example, that are preventing, let's say a test class doesn't have an email field and your org requires an email field, well, you're going to get issues with that. So be prepared for that. And to be honest with you, this was how I got into developing and into Apex, was really tiny changes to test classes. So don't be afraid to hop in there and make some changes. You'll learn a lot. And of course, if you do need help, you can always post on the Trailblazer community. It's fantastic for that. There's one for UnofficialSF, and then the automation community as well is very active. And then for you developers out there, bulkification is not free. There are mechanisms to bulkify your actions, right? But it doesn't just come for free. So it's on the developer to implement. So always test those auto launch scenarios if you're going to be including these in auto launch flows or record triggered flows. There's a helpful article, and I'll try and post this as well in the community, but there's a helpful article on upgrading packages. I think with the recent improvements to packaging around managed packages that we've done, it's gotten a little better. But do expect that there may be some pain in upgrading some of these packages from disparate versions. So just keep that in mind too. What I have found, sometimes deployment of unlocked packages can be tricky, more specifically if you're trying to upgrade unlocked packages. I've had issues in the past using change sets trying to upgrade packages. That's kind of where that previous link I posted right above there is pretty handy. And lastly, if you're doing decisions off of an action of like whether or not something was returned, for example, like if you're doing a null check, some of these actions will return empty collections, which in the eyes of like a decision element, for example, is not null. This is more of a slightly more advanced programming concept, but essentially like you can think of an empty collection as something without records, but it has been created in the system. So it's not necessarily null or, in the system's eyes. So what I've had to do in the past, and I'll show you in the demo, is basically assigning collections to a number and then doing my decision off of the number of records in the collection. So that's been something I've learned. So lastly, I will hop into my demo org to show off the data loader on guardrails. All right, so let's hop into the demo. So basically what we have here are some gas station custom object records that relate to an account. So the scenario here is you're a busy admin, you get like a weekly email from someplace sending you a list of gas stations with gas station IDs that need to be updated for a particular account. So every gas station is owned by an account in your org. So you might get 2 requests a week, 5 requests a week. It's a pain. You would just rather have the business take care of this for you. So you turn to Flow. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop into this data loader on guardrails idea and show you what it will look like. All right. So what you'll do is you would pick an account, and again, this is very use case specific. You might not even need to do this, but you'd pick the account that needs the new gas stations, and you would upload your CSV file. So in this case, the CSV file is just a single column of station IDs. So we have our API name in the CSV, and then the unique gas station IDs here. You can see some of these are formatted weirdly, so I'm going to show you another nifty thing about this too in a second. So we're going to upload our file. Hit next, and looks like our Subflow hit an error. So I'm going to show you guys how to trigger fault paths or a fake fault path with Subflows, since you can't actually use faults with Subflows, at least using the secondary dragging with the red dotted line. I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to go back and we're going to pick a different file. And by the way, with this CSV to records action, you want to save it as a regular CSV, not a UTF, I think it's 6 or 8 encoded file. So just keep that in mind too. You may hit errors. So then we have a handy little Subflow that does a whole bunch of stuff, and I'll walk you through it. But we create a record collection in memory or in the flow. Nothing is actually created yet. We have a piece of the flow that tells us which station IDs weren't found in Salesforce, and then the ones that were found. And then all of these will be associated to that Edge Communications account we picked. So then we'll go ahead and pick this cool little option called, it's just called Update Sync or Async. You would definitely want to use different language for your users, or just choose for them. So I'm going to show up another action that can create asynchronous batch jobs for you. For this example, I'll pick asynchronous. And nothing has actually been created yet. Again, we're just highlighting the collection that has been created and updated, and now we're about to commit it to the database. All right, so what this action did was it created an Apex job. And then in the flow, we basically query the Apex job object using the ID that the action outputs. So we can see we had 6 job items processed, or 6 actual records, or sorry, 6 batches with a status of complete. So then we're done. This is obviously meant to be demoed for you guys. It's not meant to be, or at least the language and the screens aren't meant to be end user friendly at this point. This is more for demo purposes, but you obviously want to create something a little more user friendly from a language perspective. So pretty easy from an end user perspective, but obviously there's a lot more to it on the other side of the house. So I'm going to show you guys how that was done. Alrighty, so here's our flow. Our first step in the process, all out of the box components. We have our standard lookup component, and that just points to any object with an account lookup. And for our file upload component, under the related record input, we have the running user ID. This is less, you don't need to create a variable for this anymore. You can just directly reference the user ID. Just a little tip, but when I made it, that wasn't possible. So just a quick note on lookup. If you are unfamiliar with lookups, or rather the lookup component, the running user actually has to have create access on whatever object you're looking for. So just keep that in mind. Or rather, create access on whatever object you're putting in here. It's less about your lookup field and more about what object you're pointing to. So, here I'm pointing to contact. Doesn't really matter as long as there is a lookup to account. You're fine. So, you may want to consider that when you're putting this onto a screen for a set of users. Make sure those users have create access to whatever object is in here. Otherwise, you'll get errors. So then we run the Subflow. So this is a best practice. If you're doing something complicated and potentially reusable across flows, you want to use a Subflow. So in this case, I'm going to dive into a Subflow that generates the collection for us. So you'll see some inputs here. Select statement, I'm not using it, but I'm going to show you a nifty trick with it. We have our account lookup that was picked, and then the output of the upload component, which is a text collection of content document IDs. And content documents are Salesforce files. So if you're unfamiliar with how the file structure works, I would recommend looking up some articles online on how the content document link, and content version all work together, because it's more complicated but more scalable than attachments are. So here's our Subflow. So I'm going to walk you through this step by step. You can see here this is an auto launch flow. In order to have a Subflow, it has to be auto launched. So our very first action is an action called convert CSV files to records. And so basically what this does is it takes an object name and a text collection of content document IDs, or a single ID. In this case, the output of that file upload component is that text collection. And you'll see here it outputs a collection of records. And you don't have to use this manual output. I just did that to keep things a little cleaner from a naming perspective. So our output is the gas station records. So what I do here is I count up the number of records in that collection, because this action will create an empty collection, which is not null. So I basically create a number variable, and I equals count is the operator, is equal to the count of the number of records in that collection. So then we do our decision check on the number of records that we just set. So if it's 0, then we basically create some custom error text. So because flows can't have a fault path in a parent flow, we basically set some custom error text that we can look for in the parent flow. So you can see here, this one's not technically a fault path, and these are, but these are all setting the same variable. So I have this variable called text error text, which is going to be used as an output of this flow. So then our loop, we just loop over the gas stations that were uploaded. And what we're going to be doing in this loop is totally optional and probably not necessary longer term, because there's a feature enhancement coming to this action that will essentially let us trim any field in the CSV file. So what we're trying to do here is removing any leading and trailing spaces from that gas station ID, so that when we query for it, we're doing so in a way that it's an accurate representation of that ID. So if you tried to compare an ID with an extra space, you wouldn't find it, basically. So in our loop, in the looped record, we're taking that station ID and we're setting it equal to the trimmed ID, which, if we look in our trimmed variable here, we're just using the trim function on that looped ID. And so because in loops we don't use the same collection, we're adding that new trimmed record to the new collection. So after we're done trimming everything, and just keep in mind this does add a considerable amount to your element limit, so I would, if you're dealing with a lot of records, I would probably remove this step so you don't hit that limit. Or you could also do a check on the number of records and then insert a screen here so that you can bypass that limit and basically just have the user keep hitting next every time you get near the limit. So we're going to run into these three actions. One of them is called extract strings from collection. This is one of my favorite actions. Basically what this does is it takes a field API name, a record collection, and this is actually optional. So if you leave this out, this will dedupe any of your values. So what this is going to do is this is going to output either or both a text collection or a CSV string of station IDs out of this collection. So it can take any field from any collection and give you a nice clean output. Super, super handy for a lot of things, and it's great for a lot of actions. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to add quotes, single quotes, to the output of that extract strings step. So if you can think about it, we'll have something like, station 1, station 1, station 2. This will turn it into station 1, station 2. So just to give you an idea of what it's going to look like. Because in SOQL, we need that to be able to do a query. We need to wrap those text strings. So this is also a really cool action. I like to use it quite a bit in screen flows. But it basically, you specify your SObject type or your record type, and you specify a text input. So this is the query you're actually getting the action to run. And you can see here I'm storing the results in this records, gas stations, and system object or collection. So just to show you what that template looks like. Some notes on this. So I used a text template here. You could use formulas, you can use text variables. Text templates are easier to work with in my opinion. Just make sure you switch into plain text mode. Otherwise you have like a bunch of funky characters and rich text, which you don't want. It will break your action. So the neat thing about this is you can create dynamic queries with this. So you can see here I reference other variables in the select statement. So in our select statement, we're just specifying the fields we want to return in this action. So we have our fields, our object, and then our where clause, which is like our filter. So where our station IDs are in the IDs that were just quoted up in our quotes action. So if you want to see what that select statement looks like, it looks something like this. So we want the ID, the name, the ID, and the owning account. And then what we do is we count up the number of gas stations that were found in that SOQL query. And then what we do is we actually count and compare actually the difference between the uploaded gas stations and the ones that we have found. And if those numbers don't match, we know that something wasn't found in the system. So then, if they don't match, we get a string, a comma-separated string, or in this case, a collection. Since we don't care about the string, we want a collection so that we can use this assignment variable in the next step. We get the collection of station IDs that were found in the system. And we do that because we can use this handy remove all assignment operator. So we have our text collection of uploaded gas station IDs, which we got from here, our extract string step. And we remove all of them from the found gas station IDs. Or sorry, flip-flop that. So we're removing all of the found gas station IDs that we just ran here from the original collection of gas station IDs. And that's going to leave us with the IDs that were not found in the system. So again, this is all optional. These are just nice UX things you can have for folks to know that, hey, 3 or 4 of the records that you had in your CSV file weren't actually found. So that wraps up the subflow. And then we go back into the parent flow. So our very first step after the subflow is run is that we check to make sure that the output of the subflow, the text error text, is blank or is null. So that's going to check to see if there were any errors set in the subflow. If there are, then we throw it over to this screen and we just show the output of the subflow error text. So then, now that we know there are no errors, we run this action called generate collection report, which generates an HTML string in a table format of the IDs, or sorry, the field names that you specify in this shown fields input. So there's lots of other little inputs in here. I would recommend checking out the article on UnofficialSF that talks through this action, because there's a lot of nifty things you can do with CSS and styling and things like that. But essentially, you can do things like related records here too, or related fields, which is super nice. So in this case, all I do is I just display the IDs and stations that were found. And then in our screen, we have the output of that action down here. And then up top, we have those gas stations that were not found up top. Then that's just the output of the subflow. And if we go back, that's just the results of this step right here. So we're just referencing this right here. So then we're going to run another action, also kind of optional, depending on your volume, but this will basically update a series of fields, whatever you want, really. But if you're basically updating the same value for a field, this is a great usage of this action. So it does it all in memory. It doesn't actually loop over anything. So it's a great way to update a lot of fields quickly and without really impacting your limits that much. So in this case, I am going over the owning account for all the records, and I am making it, and I'm setting it to the account lookup that we picked. And then also another optional step, we generate the collection again to show the new owning account in the collection. So we haven't actually done any updates yet. So next is our sync async option. So you do not want to use this language for an end user, right? You'd use your own language and however you want to represent this, but we're basically having him pick between a synchronous transaction or an asynchronous. And now again, you may not decide to use this. You know, if your object is legacy, you have a ton of bad code on it and you know they're going to hit limits, you may just want to go right to asynchronous. Or you may want to base it off of how many records are in the collection automatically. So that would just be a simple decision element based off of the count of any of the records. And then for debug purposes, we just reshow that generate collection report output here. Also optional. Then the next step, we use a generate SObject CSV report action. So all this does is it creates a CSV out of a record collection. So what this does is you can basically take a backup of the records before they're actually updated. So, you know, again, I think I referenced in the deck, but if you're doing this a lot, you may want to consider some sort of backup deletion and cleanup strategy, because all these that are getting created aren't getting deleted, so they are just going to hang out there in the system. So all these inputs are documented in the actual article that has this action. So I'm not going to cover them, but just high level, you can choose your own naming convention. There's a way to do this asynchronously too. That requires some extra steps, so unless you need it, I would recommend against using that outright. There's an input collection, right? This is what drives the CSV. Shared type and visibility, those are just two settings on content document that you need to be aware of, and all documented in that article. And then the linked records, this is a way to relate this file to other records without actually recreating the file. And then these others down here are related to related fields. So if, for example, if you've got fields that reference related records, like a formula field that would kind of be doing the same kind of thing, that would be what these are used for. Probably not super useful for this particular case. So then we just double check, or we actually just check to see if they did synchronous or asynchronous. Our update is just a normal update step. So because we've already updated all the values at that map collection action, we would just choose this first option since we have everything we need to update. And then for the async action, this is an action called the mass transactor, made by Matt Comer over at CapTech Consulting. I actually helped a little bit, but Matt did most of the heavy lifting. But good job, Matt. You basically specify your operation type, create, update, delete, your record collection that you want to do your DML on. You specify your batch size. And the way you would do this, or the thing you would care about rather, is how it might affect your limits. So if you've got an object with a ton of legacy code and you can barely create 10 records at once, you might want to set this to like 10 or 20. So you might have 20 batches of 5 records. So this is in reference to how many records are in each batch. And then you can specify an email address to notify once the job's done. And you'll notice the output here that we really care about is the job ID. So this is all stored out automatically, so you don't have to worry about setting this. But our next step is we grab the Apex job. So Apex job stores all the batch jobs that we're creating in here. So it's just one in this case, because you can have one job with many batches. So we want to check the ID, which is just the output of that mass transactor action. And so you'll notice here, there's other handy fields on this object, like status, for example. So just to kind of show you what you could do, and I don't do this here, but you could do some sort of decision element right after this. You could say job, Apex job status is equal to, does not equal to complete. You could have it right after the screen. That way they hit next, queries it again, and they could keep hitting next until it's done. Just a nice little way of doing something a little more user-friendly for them. And then our async is just the results of the job that we're looking up. So processed, total, and status. So these are just our batches, they're not the records. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. If you guys have questions, feel free to tag me in the post on the Trailblazer community.